8, 7.
Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to welcome you at today's event, which is organized by the Slovenian Ministry of Environment and Spatial Planning in cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are going to hold a panel debate under the title Transboundary Waters and Wetlands from Mitigation to Adaptation. My name is Katja Vrtovec, and I will be moderating this session. Healthy wetlands are one of the most vital ecosystems on Earth. They're a cradle of biodiversity. They deliver numerous ecosystem services. If we mention just some, they ensure drinking water, support people's livelihoods, they buffer surrounding areas from flood damage, and as they offer carbon sequestration benefits, they also have a crucial role to play in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Achieving the Paris Agreement goals and the SDGs will be impossible without protecting and restoring of our waters and wetlands. In the last 300 years, the humanity has destroyed around 90% of wetlands. And yet these ecosystems are still disappearing and 3 times faster than forests. Today, we will be addressing these challenges in transboundary context. Furthermore, we will explore the potential of transboundary cooperation for conservation of these vital ecosystems. I'm honored that today's introductory speech will be given by His Excellency Andrej Vizjak, Minister of the Environment and Spatial Planning of Slovenia. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to welcome you at this event organized by Slovenia at first ever COP Water Pavilion. Currently, Slovenia is holding the presidency of Council of the European Union. Climate, biodiversity and water issues are among the Slovenian and European Union priorities. As a country rich in biodiversity, fresh water and wetlands that extend beyond the border, Slovenia is actively promoting and contributing to water and wetland conservation and sustainable use at the national, regional and global level. We are also an active member of the UNECE Water Convention and the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. The transboundary and global effects of environmental degradation create the need for mitigation and adaptation to climate change through cross-border cooperation on water and wetlands governance and management. Let me draw your attention to European achievements. The first UNESCO's 5-country biosphere reserve on the Mura-Drava-Danube River, shared among Austria, Slovenia, Hungary, Croatia, and Serbia. This has already been recognized as an international model for regional cooperation in integrated water and wetland conservation, water security, climate resilience, and sustainable development. The effects of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic has showed the importance of our sustainable relationship with nature. I believe that this crisis was a wake-up call for all of us to jointly establish a more sustainable relationship with the planet, its natural resources, and the species we shared this planet with. I am positive that cooperative transboundary frameworks, such as 5 countries biosphere reserve, represent an excellent contribution towards our common goal, common global climate and sustainable development goals. I wish you a fruitful event, and I'm looking forward to your conclusions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Minister Vizjak, thank you very much for these words. Now, let me briefly introduce today's panelists. Alexander Korin is Senior Nature Conservation Advisor from the Institute of the Republic of Slovenia for Nature Conservation. Marta Rujas Urigo, the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. Karin Zaumberger is a Policy Officer in DG Environment from the European Commission. Jane Medwick, Chief Executive Officer of Wetlands International. And Lilian Nege, Project Manager of the Transboundary work in the Nile Basin. Let me also inform you that at the end of the presentations, we will allow a couple of minutes for Q&A session. As Minister Andrei Vizjak highlighted the importance of UNESCO 5-country biosphere reserve Mura-Drava-Danube and its global context, let me follow up on my minister's thoughts and ask our first speaker, Alexander, to explain more in depth on how will this biosphere reserve benefit people and nature. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katja, for the introduction. Kind regards in the name of the Institute of the Republic of Slovenia for Nature and Conservation, and in my name. So 2 months ago, a huge achievement in protecting Europe's rivers and wetlands was achieved by the proclamation of the world's first 5-country biosphere reserve, Mura-Drava-Danube, after a process that lasted almost 30 years from first ideas. So first of all, I would like to present you a few facts about the biosphere reserve. It's a transboundary biosphere reserve. It lies in the middle of Europe, in the northwestern edge of the Balkan Peninsula, stretches through 5 countries, from Austria through Slovenia to Croatia, Hungary, and Serbia. Altogether, 700 kilometers of rivers. It contains 3 stretches of 3 lowland rivers. The middle part of the Danube River, which is the 2nd largest river in Europe. The lower part of the Drava River, which is one of the biggest tributaries to the Danube, and the lower part of the Mura River, which is the largest tributary to the Drava River. Altogether, more than 900,000 hectares, out of which 3,000 hectares, 3,000 square kilometers, sorry, of wetlands in the core, in the buffer zone. In the next few minutes, I hope you'll be able to enjoy in our promotional video. If it doesn't work properly, I apologize. You can still watch it on YouTube. It's publicly available. But I think you'll be able to see a few impressions, get few impressions from the area. So these 3 rivers are among Europe's last rivers that still in vast stretches flow freely, create a vast majority of different habitats, different wetlands along their shores. Most of the area is covered by vast floodplain forests. And of course, all these wetlands present important habitats for many Europe's endangered species of plants and animals that live here. So the biggest gain, direct gain for nature that we hope to get from the biosphere reserve is a better protection for this environment, for this species. On the other hand, these rivers flow through the middle of Europe. They have been impacted by people for thousands of years. Many of the areas also within the biosphere reserve are damaged and in need for restoration. So the second goal or direct goal that we want to achieve from this biosphere reserve for nature is the restoration of such sites. But when we talk about biosphere reserves, we cannot and must not go around people. It's all about people and their nature. Some 900,000 people live within the biosphere reserve. mostly in the transition zone, so around these wetlands. 5 countries, 5 nations, many communities, local communities with different ideas, different needs, different issues that need to be solved. So a lot of diversity also in this sense. But they all have one thing in common. That's the dependence on the ecosystem services that this rich nature, that these 3 rivers provide to them. And the fact is that also within the biosphere reserve, these key ecosystem services and this rich nature is under threat. It's actually under threat from more or less the same threats that we are here today, the same threats that threaten our climate, basically, all around the world. But the fact is that biosphere reserves are all about sustainable development. They are sort of laboratories of sustainable development where solutions for such development should be found in next years, next decades. And we hope such solutions that will be developed here will be then, since this will be solutions on an international level, on a regional level, that they will be applicable also in other parts of the world with similar situations. But in the end, for the people, the biosphere reserve will be a success story if the quality of lives of especially local people will be improved. And what is also very important, if the quality of lives of generations to come that will live in these areas in the future will be improved. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you for this important message. You introduced us to a large transboundary wetland area, stretching over 5 countries and along 3 rivers, the so-called Amazon of Europe. And you outlined the importance of biosphere reserve to sustain this astonishing biodiversity, as well as the livelihoods of 900,000 people. For many years, Ramsar Convention has been advocating wetlands' contribution towards the SDGs and climate goals. Let me introduce our next speaker, Marta Rujas Origo. Marta, could you define more in detail how the commitments of the parties to the Ramsar Convention contribute to climate outcomes? Marta, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katia. Let me just start by thanking the government of Slovenia for hosting this very timely and important discussion about the need to cooperate to manage transboundary wetlands as a critical element for climate mitigation, adaptation, and, as you said, broader sustainable development. And it's also timely because I think that it has been quite remarkable that this COP26 has given a stronger role or recognition of the role of nature in terms of the climate agenda and the need to get the needed ambition. I would like to highlight that water is extremely important for this agenda as well. And this is also an opportunity to raise more awareness about the important connection between nature, water, and climate change. It was a real pleasure to hear from Minister Vizak about this UNESCO designation. I think it's a great example of collaboration. We know that it's possible. I wanted to add that within this big area that Alexander described so well, there are 60 wetlands of international importance. These are also known as Ramsar sites, and these are designated by the 5 countries which are parties to the convention. So this designation is as part of the legal framework of the convention and thus an important ingredient in the management of this important area. What I would like to highlight, I think that this is a very important issue in this discussion that we are having today, is that, of course, wetlands are interconnected. And climate change is also interconnected. And this is why to have global and international instruments that promote and enable this collaboration is so important. And this is where the Convention on Wetlands plays a very important role, because it is a global legal agreement. As you said, it has many years. We are in the 50th anniversary this year. And this convention provides the framework and platform for conservation, but also wise use of wetlands of 172 contracting parties. So it's a very important global instrument that, and of course, it complements and mutually supports other bilateral and regional cooperation agreements or models that we have in Europe and across the world. So a key message is that we need to use these instruments to recognize this interconnectedness between water systems and wetlands and promote synergies, and of course, engaging all the relevant stakeholders. So the convention, what the convention does, what 172 countries do, is that they are committed and they are taking action towards a common goal of conservation and wise use of this ecosystem. But there is also a third pillar, which is international cooperation. And there are different ways in which the convention contributes to this international cooperation, and I wanted to mention just a few. The first one is that because it's a global agreement, the parties agree to common policies, they develop scientific guidance and tools, they exchange experiences. So this is absolutely critical to manage the connections between water systems. But beyond that, within the convention, we also have transboundary wetlands, and we have today 65 Ramsar sites, which are transboundary, meaning that different countries designate jointly a particular area. And we also have regional initiatives. We have 19, some of which are focused on shared water ecosystems, for example, the Amazon. So as you mentioned, and as the minister mentioned before, it is important to recognize the role of wetlands on climate change. And they have a very important role as being the most efficient carbon store. The wetlands store 30% of the land-based carbon. They're also critical for resilience and adaptation, regulating water flows. And this connection has been prioritized by the parties. And because wetlands have such an important function in the global climate system for mitigation, water security, disaster risk reduction, the commitments and efforts under the convention can be leveraged to deliver climate action. And we have been hearing during 2 weeks, the need to have a level of ambition that is unprecedented to control the climate change. And we know that without halting the loss of these ecosystems and rapidly scaling up restoration, we will not be able to meet the global climate goals. And we have a very concrete example. Our technical panel just issued a new guidance, which is focused on peatlands, which is a very important type of wetland, very rich in carbon. And the conclusion is that we need to protect the remaining intact peatlands and restore 50 million hectares of drained peatlands by 2030 to be able to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So this is a very concrete action that we need to take in order to conserve wetlands and at the same time contribute to the ambition on climate change. So the parties also commit to developing national wetlands inventories or to update them. And this is, knowing where they have the wetlands is really important to include wetlands in the greenhouse gas accounts. But it's also very important to integrate wetlands within the nationally determined contributions. As you know, a way that parties can use to fill their commitments under the Paris Agreement is conserving and restoring wetlands. So this is where, there is a readiness that we have based on the obligations and efforts of the convention to deliver on this climate ambition and to scale up restoration, for example, in the UN decade that is focused on this regard. So another important commitment of the parties is reflected in its strategic plan, what the parties have identified and prioritized and develop a target to increase the area underrepresented that is representing types which are not sufficiently covered within the conservation efforts. And these include peatlands, but also blue carbon ecosystems. They also have a target on restoration of degraded wetlands with the objective of conservation of biodiversity, but also disaster risk reduction and climate mitigation and adaptation. And finally, the parties are also, on the basis of their wetlands inventories, reporting on wetland extent under the convention, but also for one of the indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a way of tracking progress, which is absolutely important to all the commitments that we have on the Convention, biodiversity, and climate change. So to conclude, it's really important to realize the full potential of wetlands as climate change solutions. And this requires transboundary and international cooperation at multiple levels. And for this, we must fully leverage and build on the instruments that exist in a synergistic manner so that we can reverse the loss of wetlands and ensure that we continue to receive their benefits for people and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for this comprehensive overview. And as we heard from Marta, water and wetlands are at the core of sustainable development and socio-economic progress, indispensable in tackling the climate change, and also a central building block of green recovery. Our next speaker is Karin Zaumberger, Policy Officer for Biodiversity and Climate Nexus in the Environment from the European Commission. Karin, could you give us some insight on how does the European Commission see the role of water and wetlands for climate and biodiversity? Could you give us some examples of concrete measures for implementing the European Green Deal? Karin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katja, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to intervene in this important panel. The European Union has supported green infrastructures already for several years through its green infrastructure strategy adopted in 2013. Back then, green infrastructure was described as an interconnected network of natural areas, and that included agricultural land, greenland, wetlands, floodplains, urban green spaces, forest reserves, nature plant communities, and all those ecosystems that naturally regulate storm flows, temperatures, flood risk, and water, air, and ecosystem quality, and capture and store carbon. Since then, the European Union has really made what I would say a quantum loop through the European Green Deal. Next slide, please. In this European Green Deal, the protection and restoration of ecosystems is really at the heart and center of the European Green Deal and its related initiatives. It is based on the understanding that when ecosystems thrive, societies and economies can thrive, and when ecosystems suffer, their capacity to deliver crucial ecosystem services on which societies and economies depend dwindle. Biodiversity and ecosystem and nature-based solutions are an important element of the European Green Deal initiatives, which have been launched over the last 1.5 years. Next slide, please. In particular, I would like to point out the EU's biodiversity strategy for 2030 to bring back nature into our lives. When it was adopted last year during the first wave of the pandemic, actually some people thought, well, maybe at this point in time, we cannot afford to have a strategy on biodiversity. However, right the opposite happened. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic and the tragedy it brought with it really showed us, it amplified the awareness, and it showed us the importance of nature in our life. And then as a consequence of that, we can say that actually this strategy for 2030 is perhaps the most ambitious of its kind, with tangible and quantitative targets in many factors, also including for wetland and peatland areas. Next slide, please. One can say the EU biodiversity strategy has, broadly speaking, 4 main elements. It's protect what is still there. We know that we have already degraded and lost a lot of nature within the European Union, so we absolutely need to protect what is still there, and this implies the implementation of a connected network of protected areas, including the Natura 2000 network. We need to restore ecosystems, both in rural and urban areas. We need to restore terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. And here, when it comes to restoration, we have heard wetlands have been degraded a lot, so wetlands are a priority ecosystem for restoration. And at the moment as we speak, there's a nature restoration law under preparation, and let's keeping fingers crossed, there is a possibility that this nature restoration law will be proposed next week. We know that in order to protect and restore nature and bring nature back to a path on recovery, we need to address the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, and that means fast and deep transformative change. Hence, enabling this transformative change is a key feature of the strategy. And we hope to do this, including through stepping up the implementation of nature-based solutions and the new biodiversity governance framework. And finally, through the strategy, the European Union confirmed its willingness to lead to adopt an ambitious global post-2020 biodiversity framework in the next conference of the parties under the Convention Convention on Biological Diversity. Next slide, please. As having said, the nature-based solutions is like a red thread throughout these four key elements. We find that the investment in these nature-based solutions and the protection and restoration of wetlands is a key nature-based solution. That also means mainstreaming biodiversity in practice. It actually holds the opportunity for green jobs and business opportunities. We think that nature-based solutions, including transboundary wetlands, deliver multi-benefits, as some speakers have already pointed out. It includes flood and erosion protection, water proliferation, purification, and carbon sequestration and storage, as well as the provision for space for nature. Through implementation of nature-based solutions, we are making a significant contribution to address the interdependent emergencies of climate change and biodiversity loss in an integrated manner. However, nature-based solutions are of course not a panacea. They can only be effective when implemented in addition to decarbonization and societal changes. The implementation of nature-based solutions needs interdisciplinary collaboration, and hence it contributes to enabling and to effecting transformative change. Over the last month, we had many voices stating the need for a resilient recovery from the pandemic. In fact, the slowdown of the global economy and the huge recovery packages presented a unique opportunity to make transformative change happen on the ground. However, 1.5 years later, almost 2 years later now, we also have to admit there is a bemol, as meanwhile, we observe that unfortunately still far too few countries have seized this opportunity in their recovery plans. A big majority of plans aims to restart the economy as it was before, and there was no climate, and as if there were no climate and biodiversity emergency. So hopefully, as we are still in the pandemic, we are still not really fully emerged, hopefully more and more countries will seize this opportunity. We have the knowledge and resources to address this planetary emergency we are in. The challenge is to do what needs to be done in the short time left. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you. There is a clear need for connected water systems approach in which wetlands are valued and managed, as we heard several times, and as a part of the water resource. My question goes to our next speaker, Jane Medwick, Chief Executive Officer of Wetlands International. Jane, how can we best connect basin-wide and local water solutions? Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katja, and thanks to Slovenia for hosting this important event. So wetlands, as we've heard, are amongst the most heavily impacted and degraded of all of Earth's systems. And the climate science is clear. We need wetlands back in good condition in order to slow the climate, as well as to buffer the predicted weather extremes. And with 47% of the world's inhabited land being in river valleys, it's not really surprising that wetlands face so much pressure. With over 300 transboundary river systems, international action is clearly needed if wetlands are not going to be further compromised. And across each river basin, we need to bring conservation requirements in line with climate action and development activities. And Wetlands International would say that we need to give special attention to seasonal river flows and flood pulses, which are driving the ecological processes in wetlands, affecting the biodiversity, but also the productivity of the land and the waters for fishing and farming. So as you reduce the flow, so you reduce the natural productivity and decrease climate resilience. And every artificial water storage or diversion scheme will interrupt the natural flow of a river, of course, but the extent of any damage on the surrounding ecosystems, and the impact on nature and people will depend entirely on the location, the size, and how that scheme is operated. Actions in one location might bring local benefits, but could at the same time cause a cascade of problems for others elsewhere. So to avoid such problems, we need to see wetlands as entire water systems, connecting lands and cities from source to sea. And we need to think beyond the environmental impact assessments of individual schemes and consider the combined effect of groups of developments on water resiliency across whole landscapes. And with climate change, we need even greater scrutiny on water developments and how they affect wetlands, especially in drought-prone regions like Africa's Sahel, seen here. For example, the planned construction of water infrastructure in the upper reaches of the Niger River in Guinea for hydropower and irrigation development will cause further shrinking of the inner Niger Delta wetland in Mali downstream. This would undermine the livelihoods of around 2 million people who are fishers, farmers and pastoralists there, and dramatically increase the risk of catastrophic droughts from 1 in 50 currently to around 1 in 12 years. So decision support tools developed here show how changes in the flood dynamics affect ecosystem services under different dam scenarios and indicate how climate change affects the likelihood of water-related conflicts and outmigration. And making this data available has at least caused potential investors in this dam to pause and consider further. Alternatives are still possible. So green development pathways could be incentivized by donors and implemented through public-private partnerships to support flood-based economies and to safeguard and restore wetlands as part of that. So improving water resiliency and climate adaptation. And to give another example from another continent, in South America, yes, back to that slide if we can. In South America, the fluvial system Paraná, Paraguay is the main water collector in La Plata Basin and a massive wetland corridor. Maybe we can show the slide. It stretches from the largest wetland in the world, the Pantanal, shared by Brazil, Bolivia and Paraguay, to the Paraná Delta downstream of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And this Paraná, Paraguay system is now experiencing extreme and devastating drought and fires due to a combination of low rainfall and an acceleration in clearance for agriculture. And in addition to this, many hydropower investments are planned in upstream tributaries, as well as river regulation for navigation development, all of which would reduce the capacity for the wetlands to buffer the impacts of weather extremes that we can expect due to climate change. So in this system, we see an urgent need to bring a shared understanding by nations of how maintaining and restoring the connectivity and flow regime of the river and wetland system can enhance climate resiliency. As part of this, strategic environmental and social safeguards must guide the design of mega projects, such as the Transboundary Hidrovia navigation. And diversified production models should also be incentivized, so we can reduce the regional resilience on monocultures like soy and reinforce resilience to climate change. So these are just two quite big examples which highlight the dangers of overlooking the role of the remaining wetlands and the role they play in climate adaptation. It's really time to put water and wetlands front and center in taking action for the climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. I will add a bit to your statistics. 153 countries worldwide share transboundary rivers, lakes, and aquifers, and that accounts roughly for 60% of global freshwater resources. These water resources serve to more than 40% of global population. Yet, many of those basins still lack joint management bodies or agreements, and less than half of those that are operational contain provisions on climate adaptation measures. Now let me turn to Liliane Niégué, the project manager of the Transboundary work in the Nile Basin. Liliane, based on your experience in the Nile River Basin, can you tell us how to strengthen biodiversity conservation and utilization of ecosystem services in wetlands of transboundary significance? Liliane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katja. And of course, great thanks to Slovenia for creating space at this global platform for the representation of the voices of our constituents, the people who are really feeling the impact of the changing climate. All the speakers before me have really painted a clear picture on the importance and the role of wetlands in mitigation and adaptation. So the science shows us that we are heading to 2.7 degrees. How do we really ensure that we harness this power of wetlands? In our work in the Nile Basin, we really got to see how changes in wetlands from increased floods, droughts, and reduction in river flows actually impact people's health, their food systems, and even on peace and security, which we saw from competition for water and the resources from these wetlands. In the case of transboundary wetlands, as you can imagine, the issues are even worse. So between 2019 and 2020, we came together with GIZ and the Nile Basin Initiative to develop management instruments as plans for 3 transboundary wetlands that are highly significant to the region because of their social, economic, and ecological benefits. So this is the Sangobe Minziro wetland that is shared between Tanzania and Uganda. We also have the Semliki Delta that is shared between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda, and the Sositeko wetland, shared wetland by Kenya and Uganda. So we were lucky that this work began right before the pandemic hit, allowing us to conduct intense consultations with the wetland users across borders. And their message was really clear. Climate issues need to be addressed. People need to adapt. Previously, they were used to 2 rainy seasons, and now it is shrinking. It is now 1 rainy season. The floods are becoming much more intense. And of course, where there were thorny issues or discussions, we ensured that these were actually resolved before moving on. So with the understanding that wetlands are, of course, our best allies in reducing emissions, climate change became a central part of the discussion. And as such, ambition for both mitigation and adaptation were included in these transboundary wetland management plans. And we did this by putting them as a subset of nature-based approaches that would protect and sustainably manage and restore wetland ecosystems to address these challenges that have already been mentioned. So when we look at ecosystem protection and restoration, and also bringing in together the livelihood approach, the measures that would promote sustainable land use practices, as an example, that would improve livelihoods and reduce degradation, such as paludiculture, rewetting of peatlands, were actually proposed by the participants, by the stakeholders in these processes, and were included in the management plans. And of course, these measures, among others, have to be anchored somewhere. So together we looked at how do we actually strengthen the governance of transboundary resources. So these questions were talking to how can governments involved ensure wetlands and peatlands are visible and prioritized in their NDCs? How can they leverage climate financing to implement these measures? And some of the things that they came up with was, for example, strengthening the protection measures, designating additional transboundary Ramsar sites. And I hope that with the next one, the 66th transboundary wetland Ramsar site will come from the Nile Basin region. So in closing, for us to really feel the adaptation co-benefits, I share 3 key areas of action. 2030 is not far. So, and this is also the duration of the management plans, 2020 to 2030. So therefore, it is urgent for countries to actually raise wetland ambition, and for us to get closer to national, regional, and global goals, those that have already been mentioned before me. Secondly, We need to scale up action and investment in wetland conservation and management to address all these rising needs and bring impact to the values they provide. These 3 transboundary wetlands are yet to be financed. We do not have time. We've had several commitments through the past weeks, and it would be interesting to actually see how much is dedicated to wetlands, including those in the Nile Basin. Lastly, local actors, the ones who actually feel the impacts firsthand, are key to delivering on wetland conservation and management. So their meaningful participation is very important in ensuring the measures I mentioned actually yield impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lilian. Thank you very much for this contribution. And thank you to all our panelists for their contributions. We will use the remaining time and take maybe a question from the audience. If there is one, here I would like to ask the technical team on the spot for some assistance. Is there maybe a question from the audience? No.
Oh, no question.
Okay, now I can see the audience. Before I couldn't. Okay.
Maybe somebody online has a question?
Okay. Well, I think regarding the time, we'll need to wrap up soon. So I will round up this discussion, and I'm referring to our panelists. If there was a key message for our audience today, what would this one be? Jane and Marta? Yeah. Do we start with Alexander? Alexander, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly.
I don't have such a clear message, but I think, yeah, it's clear that we have to, that we are on the path of restoring wetlands in next years, next decades. It's clear, they have to be restored, and I think that people are realizing this fact more and more. And we have to start on the field with small projects, with small initiatives, then regionally, like this concrete Transboundary Biosphere Reserve, for instance, and then apply this wider. But we have to start on the field, and we have to start with small projects. That's the way forward, I think.
Thank you, Alexander. To Marta?
Thank you. I think that this event has shown us examples, very concrete examples at all levels, at global, regional, local. And I think that for me, the main message is that we know how to do it. I think that we know the evidence of why wetlands and water are so important for climate change and for other benefits, for people, for biodiversity, for disaster risk reduction. So I think that there is evidence that we need to scale up efforts to conserve what is a very valuable ecosystem. You know, we cannot do anything without water, and also the most threatened. And my second message would be, we have instruments. We have the Convention on Wetlands, we have regional agreements, we have the tools. So how can we leverage these tools so that we can have the level of impact that we need, so that we can really turn the tide on biodiversity, on climate change, and reverse the loss of this important ecosystem? Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. To Karin?
Thank you, Katja. And my message actually complements the one which you just heard. It's nothing new. Water is life, and transboundary wetlands are important for water. So I think now we have the choice whether we continue to steal the future from our children, or whether we decide to heal it for them. I really appeal to unite behind science and act accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. To Jane?
Yes, indeed, the science is very clear. The knowledge about the value and the importance of water and wetlands in climate action has been clear for quite some time, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be making much difference in terms of the kind of developments we see. And so I would say that my message is we need clear targets for water and wetlands as part of climate action. The same as now is coming in for forests, to halt the decline and to incentivize positive action for wetlands. And alongside that, we need really big scrutiny on large water infrastructure investments. Many of these are coming through in the name of climate action, but I'm afraid that many of them will further diminish wetlands and their ability to give us climate resilience. So the world needs to give really close scrutiny on these developments, and that needs action by the investment banks as well as the governments.
Thank you, Jane. And Liliane already sent our 3 clear messages. Liliane, would you like to add something?
Thank you, Katja. Maybe just that the role of good governance cannot be overemphasized. So for transboundary wetlands, cooperation along shared goals and the challenges is actually very vital. So bringing this together with the science is very important. Thank you.
Thank you to all. Thank you. So allow me to briefly summarize some key messages of this session. We heard that wetlands as an integrative part of global water cycle are among the most effective sinks for carbon and have a crucial part to play in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. But we need to keep in mind that only healthy ecosystems can deliver benefits we all depend on. Therefore, without halting the loss of wetlands, as it was already said several times, and rapidly scaling up their restoration, we will not meet neither the Paris Agreement goals nor the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We also heard how necessary the cross-border cooperation in respect to transboundary wetlands and shared water systems is, and that the solutions to transboundary waters and wetlands problems often emerge from local communities. Furthermore, it was highlighted that transboundary wetlands are wonderful large-scale nature-based solutions, providing a multitude of great environmental, social, and economic value. And finally, water is a primary media through which we already feel the negative effects of climate change. Our panelists, I believe, clearly illustrated how today's transboundary decision on waters and wetlands are likely to shape the future. I would like to thank to the distinguished panelists, the audience, as well as our hosts, Stockholm International Water Institute, and partner organizers. Thank you.